Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're very happy to be here tonight with Jennifer Neal in conversation with Ruby Hamad for a celebration of Notes on Her Color, a novel. This event tonight is co-hosted by the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history, and we are always honored to get to co-host events with Auburn Avenue. So first I'll introduce Ruby Hamad, who is a journalist, author, and academic preparing to submit her PhD in media studies at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Her Guardian essay, How White Women Use Strategic Tears to Silence Women of Color, became a global flashpoint for discussions of white feminism and racism and inspired her best-selling debut book, White Tears, Brown Scars. Her writing has also featured in Prospect Magazine, The New York Times, and more. And White Tears, Brown Scars, as I was saying in the green room, has been a constant, steady seller for Charis since it came out, and has certainly been an important touch point for so many people. So we're very honored to get to have Ruby here as part of this conversation with Jennifer Neal. Jennifer is an American-Australian author, artist, and occasional stand-up comedian. She is a graduate of Florida State University, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. She's written for NPR, Playboy, Gay Magazine, The Cut, The Root, and many other publications. She is a McDowell Fellow and a Pushcart Prize-nominated essayist. She lives in Berlin for now, where she works as a freelance producer and translator. So we're so glad we have folks watching from all over the world. That's one of the great things about doing virtual events is that we can have folks watching from Berlin and everywhere else. Hopefully some folks from Australia with us too tonight. And obviously folks from Atlanta and across the South. We want to encourage you, if you would like to ask a question anytime during the event, get it in a little early so that we can work it into the conversation. But if you don't have anything to say, don't worry about it. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. We want you to put your feet up and feel like you're in your living room listening to two brilliant people talk about art and music and writing and so much more. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for celebrating this book with us here at Charis.
Thanks, Ia. And thank you so much for having me be a part of this. Congratulations, Jennifer. As people would know, well, maybe some of you would know, I'm definitely a very big fan of this book and of Jennifer's now. And I was honored to be asked to provide a blurb. And as I said in my blurb, there's an assuredness to this novel, to this writing that tells me that this person is born to tell stories. I'm getting emotional because it really moved me. So congratulations and thank you for having me here. It's it's an honor for me for you to respect my work as well. So welcome, Jennifer, everybody.
Thank you, Ruby. I just want to say I love you and I'm such a huge fan of your work as well. And thank you so much for being a part of this event. And I'm going to tell everybody preemptively, if you have not read White Tears, Brown Scars, please go read it. It is an imperative book.
Oh, thank you. It's very kind of you to say. But now let's get to the book of the moment, Notes on Her Color by Jennifer Neal. So I want to start with the title. I found it it's very clever and unlike the book itself, quite like it's double layered, right? So it's both literary in that it's notes, it's words, reading words. Let me tell you about this woman's relationship with her skin color, with her race. But it's also foreshadows the musical element in the book because music, and I'll discuss that a bit more later, but just it plays such a big role in the novel. Did you have this title early on? Was that always the title?
No, it wasn't actually. The original title was The Color of Her Blood, which is a line taken directly from the book when Gabrielle is talking about her mother returning home from the mental health crisis. And sorry if that's a spoiler for anybody who hasn't read the book. But, and she's referring to her mother, how she kind of doesn't have the ability to pass anymore. And she talks about the color of her blood kind of not being there anymore. Like she's missing this very vital part of herself. And that was what the original title referenced. However, and this is a good reason to, this is one of the benefits of having a publisher like Catapult and Penguin Random House actually, is that they both thought that using the word blood in the title made it sound more like mystery or crime fiction or thriller, and that risked perhaps misbranding the book, and that it would confuse readers a bit more as to what the book was about, which is something I wouldn't have even thought about, but it made a lot of sense. So we actually put our heads together, all of us, my editor at Catapult, Alicia, my editors at Penguin, Radia, and Meredith, and my agent, Millie. We all started this chain thread and started brainstorming ideas because at that point, I'd done several drafts of the book with them. So we all knew what it was about. And Radia actually suggested the title Notes on Her Color. And I loved it because it's a pun, but not one the reader will immediately understand until they read the book. But it's also something that's illustrated beautifully in the cover art, which is just incredible. I could not ask for better art. And of course, Notes on Her Color is notes that basically this protagonist, Gabrielle, is talking about her mother. It's a story of a mother as told by her daughter. And so that's what the notes references to, and the colorability is referenced in how they can both change the color of their skin. And notes is also equivalent to music, which is the structure around which the book is based. And I liked that it had kind of a melodic intonation to it, the title of the book, and I loved how it described it so beautifully, and brought her mother back into the title. So that's why we went with that. Everybody loved it.
Yeah, it's a brilliant title. So staying on music, so Mahler's Symphony number 3. So that sets, it sets the 6-part structure to the book, making the book itself musical and music not just part of the story. I think it was at the Chicago Times review, and the reviewer's name has escaped me. I apologize. That described the book itself as a musical composition. So that's how integral music is. Are you a musician? And sort of what is your relationship to music that it was to play such an integral part of not just the story itself, but the structure of the book?
Yeah, music has always been a huge part of my life. I grew up in a house full of music. My dad was is still really into Motown. So is my mom, for that matter. My brother is like a metalhead and into punk rock and all those things. And I always had an appreciation for like 90s alternative femme rock, which I know we've discussed in passing because of our mutual love of Fiona Apple. And I also love, how do you not love her? And I also love classical music. It's just something I've always really been a huge fan of. But I wasn't that familiar with Mahler's work until I moved to Berlin. And his work kind of rose to popularity after it was rediscovered after the war ended, because Mahler is a Jewish bohemian, like literally from the area of Bohem, I think Bohemia, which was banned under the Third Reich. So what you've experienced in the past 20 years in particular is kind of like a renaissance of his work. And I really love going to the Philharmonie in Berlin. And I had already known that music was going to be a huge part of this book, but it wasn't until I sat and listened to his symphony that I realized, oh no, this is the way I want to structure it, because I wanted to create a book that had the feel and dynamics of music. I wanted it to have moments that were violent, but moments that were kind of violent moments that were buffered by softness, by affection, by sentimentality. It's not something I think a lot of people would understand, because I know how weird it sounds, but I think a good piece of writing is very similar to experiencing a good piece of music, in that it takes you through a variety of emotions and it brings you to a stronger sense of human connection, either with the people around you, the room or the space that you're in, or the people who were performing the music. And I wanted people to have that experience with my book. I wanted them to, dig deep into certain corners of their own emotions that maybe they weren't used to experiencing in writing. Maybe that's a little bit arrogant, or maybe it's kind of silly, but that was always my objective. And I felt like if I was going to do that, I would have to center something in that book that touched me that deeply. And it was definitely Mahler's Third Symphony.
Mm. I don't know how familiar you are with Edward Said's work, the literary professor and advocate, and he, he critiqued Western representations, but he also is a lover of literature and of music, and he talked about this concept, or he coined this concept called contrapuntal awareness and contrapuntal reading, which he got from music. And so it's this idea that, because in music, classical music has the main, I'm not a musician, so I'm trying to remember exactly how he put it. It's just listening to you talk reminded me of how he puts it. So you have the main notes, but then in the background, you have others that are, other harmonies are going on. And so it's the way in which the main story, so if you're going to translate to literature, so you've got the main story, but it never exists on its own. So you have other layers that are going on, and when it all comes together, it's one beautiful harmonious notes. And so when he's talking about contrapuntal awareness, it's being aware of more than one thing at the same time. It's essentially how he translates that. And I think that I interpret that as somewhat similar to what you're saying. So it really reminds me of it. And because a lot of people like they know Edward Said for being about Orientalism, but he was a music lover and very much a lover of literature, as a literary professor. So yeah, really reminded me of a very, very similar concept of how music relates to the writing, but also of how you wanted to make sure that there was never just one aspect to your story, and how you're going to imbue it with all these other layers, which is what classical music does. So yeah. And let's talk briefly. And so everybody, we are going to leave time at the end for questions. So, and to speed that process up, if you can start thinking of your questions now, so that we can, get it straight into it towards the end. Let's talk briefly about the setting. Now, Florida, it's set in Florida, and it plays it does play like a central role in a story. And as someone who lived in Florida for a bit of my youth, it really, and this was we're talking about 20 years ago now, so it really reminded me of being there, conjured up the heat, the humidity, just those sort of hazy days. And as listeners may or may not know, you're Australian American, currently based in Berlin. So why Florida for this story?
Well, actually, I originally wanted to write the story in Berlin, if you can believe it. I wanted it set in Berlin. And that was actually the reason why I moved there. I want to write a speculative fiction novel in Berlin. That's what makes the most sense to me. But then the first two drafts I wrote about this story just didn't make any sense. They weren't good, basically. And I thought, I've done a lot of nature writing. I've worked with some really incredible nature writers and created content for them online and in literary journals. And I love the idea of environment as character, how, when you incorporate a place into a story, how it changes the way that people can interact with each other. It changes their dynamic. And I thought maybe I'm just not as familiar with Berlin at the point when I started writing this book as I was with Florida, where I was raised. And I guess I'm also, because I'm so aware of that history and aware and very familiar with that ecology, like being there, I just feel automatically like I understand what's happening. Sorry, my computer is having a moment. And I feel like because Florida is this kind of magical place that shouldn't necessarily exist, because I feel like it's a place that's really magical. The way I describe it to other people is if you think of the United States as like a body of water, Maine would be the lily pads floating on top, And Florida would be where everything else kind of sinks beneath, you know. It's got the 6 plastic beer rings floating around. It's got the used condoms floating around. It's got the chupacabra going around. You know, it's where all like these magical creatures and all of this life exists. And everything that you would want to see in a place or expect to for a people to inhabit exists there. I feel like it's one of those kind of hubs that attracts so many different types of personalities and so much um, dynamic and, quite frankly, violent natural catastrophes. So to me, it felt like a place where magic exists and occurs naturally. And if I wanted to tell a story where magic is at the heart of the book, then it made sense to choose a natural environment that was also magical. And that's the way I see Florida, despite the fact that, you know, it's, well, I mean, if you think about it this way, it's a magical place that is run by literal monsters. So to me, it just felt really natural. And the moment I incorporated that part into the story, everything else just fell into place. And I really enjoyed talking about, you know, the different types of plants and the different types of snakes and talking about tropical storms and hurricanes and talking about like the weird hoarding culture that you get when hurricane season rolls around, which I wrote in the middle of the pandemic when literally nobody could find toilet paper. So it all made sense. And I love the fact that it's all encompassing. And I love the way that you describe things like the humidity being kind of oppressive and all pervasive, and it's all kind of hazy. And that's exactly what I wanted it to convey. It was something I hope that everybody could appreciate, but I specifically was looking at Floridians and hoping that they would understand exactly what I was talking about.
Mm. Yeah, well, like I said, not Floridian, but I spent some formative time of my life in my 20s here, and yeah, it definitely brought it all back. So
We'll have to talk about that off camera. I want to know more.
yeah, lots of stories. Yeah. So the story. So let's get into that sort of the nitty gritty of the novel. Try not to give too many spoilers for people that haven't had a chance to read it yet, and if you haven't, please do so. You will love it, I am sure. And so, literally and metaphorically, the book is about passing. The ability that the character Gabrielle and her mother Tallulah, and it's this relationship between them that is the crux of the story. And so Gabrielle, I'm just explaining for people that may not know, had inherited the ability to change her color from her mother, and has not yet been able to master it. So she's learning to step into that. And it's an ability that is exploited by their father, Robert, who has internalized racism and internalized his trauma as a Black man to the hatred of his Blackness, which he then projects onto his wife and daughter, and essentially, terrorizing them into always being white, and kind of summed up in, which I will start with this. There's the line where you said only 2 dark things were allowed in the house, being whiskey and him, being the father. It's so deceptively straightforward, but we actually learn a lot about all the characters through that line, through that sentence. Can you break that down and use that as a lead in to then discuss, which I'll jump in again, discuss that relationship between Gabrielle and Tallulah?
Sure. So it's really important to establish who the main characters are in the beginning of the book and what it gives the reader some kind of idea of what they can expect as the story unravels. And I felt like the best way to do that was by through her eyes, so how she saw him, how she saw herself relative to him. And the whole concept of passing in and of itself is something that we learn from our parents. We learn from the people who are obviously giving us our education to the world into which we are born. And for her to say that about her father, I felt like said so much, not just about how she saw him and her relationship with him, but the expectations that she had of herself in that moment. And it also says a bit more about obviously his emotional and mental state, right? Because you understand immediately that alcohol is going to be important to his character arc in the story, and you understand inherently that if that is the only other thing dark in the house, it's kind of playing on this whole idea of like dark things being bad, which is something that's really pervasive in the discussions of race and passing and color throughout history. And I just wanted to introduce that early so that there was an anchoring point that the reader could latch onto, so that they understood how color was important in this story.
Yeah, and it's brilliantly done. So again, for listeners, so everything in the house is white, furniture, everything, and so of course then the mother and Gabrielle, the daughter, are then coerced, not just pressure, but coerced and forced into being white to sort of satisfy their father's sort of internal trauma and. So there's two really interesting elements with how you play with the concept of passing. So the first is that how we feel we need to sort of pass, to conform, so that we can fit in and navigate society. And then the second is how, so even, it's just the concept that we do pass, right? As in, the people of color pass. And the second is how passing or fitting in necessarily limits and diminishes us in many ways, because Tallulah and Gabrielle can be any color they want. They can do any color, and yet they're learning to spend their time in the absence of color as being white. Why was it important for you to sort of showcase this through magical realism? It's obviously passing is something a story that can be and has been and is told and lived every day as natural, in a naturalistic style, and that is real. What is it in magical realism imbue that a straight style, do you think, would not have or could have missed?
Yeah, so to go to the magical realism part first, what I love about speculative fiction in general is that it takes things that are seemingly really mundane, terms or experiences or things that we just accepted as normal, and it problematizes them. So it kind of interrogates their connotations, their historical context, their illusions, their intrinsic meanings, and it twists them in such a way that it makes the mundane into something bizarre. And the way I started with that was by examining the terminology that's used to describe us in the first place, which is person of color. And I thought, well, color is the entire, wheel, the entire color spectrum. And yet me as a Black person, I'm often put into like this category of this Black void. That's the color that's used to describe me, when Black is actually not technically the color of my skin. Not to say that we should say, oh, color is a construct or whatever, which is anti-Black. And of course, I understand that race is a construct, but at the same time, that's a construct that governs my life. I wanted to examine color theory in that subject. So Blackness in terms of paint is actually the absorption of all colors. Red, green, blue, white, yellow, everything in the color spectrum is absorbed in the color Black. And I was really inspired by a lot of work that visual artists have done in unpacking that term by problematizing it visually. And I'm thinking of Carrie Mae Weems in particular, and her photographic series, Colored People, I think was the title of it, that was displayed at the Guggenheim for her retrospective almost a decade ago, where she took photographic images, Black and white, of Black children and overlaid them with color tint, just to get you to consider what the color Black really is and what it means, and to give it more dynamism, to give it more insight, to give it more emotion, because in the language that we use, Black is often, Black as death, Black plague. It's used to refer to things like depression. It's used to refer to things like the absence of feeling and coldness. And that has never been my experience as a Black person. It is warmth, it is emotion, it is feeling, it's anger, it's joy, it's kindness, It's all these other things that I feel like are left out of the conversation in terms of what it means to be a Black person or a person of color. So that was the initial genesis of what made me think of, well, she's not just passing into white or Black. She can pass into all these other colors. And that and in order to examine that more fully, I was able to draw upon a rich kind of literary history of how color is used, like green envy, seeing red, yellow bellied, feeling blue, as in somebody's feeling sad. And I thought I would incorporate that. So I wanted to really put color theory in conversation with critical race theory and see if there was something new that we could discover at the same time. And what I ended up doing was being able to accurately, or I hope accurately since it's fictional, but being able to describe a whole person who had all of these emotions that I feel like are often filtered out of a woman of color's experience in everyday life. Because at the end of the day, she's a human being. She's going through these things. I wanted her to feel human. And that was just one of the mechanisms that I thought would be most effective in conveying not only her journey through discovering herself as this queer woman of color, but also to help the reader kind of understand what she was feeling, since she was having difficulty kind of expressing herself along the way as she breaks out of this sort of emotional stuntedness that she's born into. The other aspect of passing is, what it looks like in everyday life, in the real world, in the realistic world. And her mother and her are able to pass in like this three-dimensional color sense. Her father, on the other hand, Robert, he passes in a very real life kind of way. So he can't change the color of his skin, but he adopts all of the mannerisms, the behavior, the vocabulary, the political affiliations that he felt like he needed to in order to pass into whiteness. And I wanted those two characters to be positioned next to each other so that you couldn't say like, oh, this is fictional, this isn't real life, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I also wanted to incorporate those really real life examples into the story to show that these people are actually kind of mirror reflections of one another. It's just that I'm taking one all the way to a kind of magical realm, but the other is plucked straight from real life. And that's why I included him, because I guess I just didn't want people to dismiss this experience altogether as being wholly unrealistic, because to be honest, it is.
Thank you. So this is the kind of deep thought that I'm talking about when I said that this book is just so impressive for a debut. That there's so much there about musical theory, literary theory, life. It's just hearing you explain that just sort of is, it's brilliant. So thank you again for bringing this into the world. I just want to stay on Robert a little bit. How was it as a Black woman to write a character, and male character who's so mired in his own tragedy, but can only know how to project that outwards and take it out on the Black women in his life? I love that you didn't over-explain it, but you gave his little of his backstory, that a lot of it did also come from intergenerational trauma passed down to him, wanting to play the piano, but not being able to because his own mother didn't want him playing the white people's music, and then kind of using that to then force his daughter to play it. So going back to the, without letting him off the hook for how he treats his family, you gave us a kind of a seed of why he is what he is, but how, still emotionally and even technically, how was it to actually write that in words?
Yeah, it was hard. It's hard to write villains when you also empathize with them, and you yourself. Well, I wanted to hate him, this horrible person, who I crafted. It was kind of fun though, writing a terrible personality who that people are going to hate. It's going to get underneath people's skin. But at the same time, it was really heartbreaking because I'm pulling all these examples from real life, from people who, like in the public eye, I was thinking of people like Justice Clarence Thomas. I was thinking of Herman Cain. I was thinking of a lot of like Black conservative figures who were really kind of strung out on the respectability politics. And when I crafted him, I really had to kind of sit with this idea of who could possibly evolve to be this terrible. And I was really grateful for a lot of the editorial insights from my editors, and especially Alicia from Catapult, because originally his backstory wasn't in there. I was kind of thinking of the idea of when you see people, or when you hear of people who are in an abusive relationship or an abusive marriage, a lot of the time you ask yourself, why is this person in there? Why have they stayed there? Like, or what do they see in this person? And the truth is, you just never really know, unless you were one of the people in that relationship. And so I thought it wasn't necessary to explain why, because a lot of people would probably be in relationships like that, but you don't necessarily need to know why. It's just, this is the present situation and you have to deal with it from there. But I guess the difference between that and a story is that you can give a why. And I think I was thinking in that moment a little too realistically, but Alicia suggested that, the reader would need a little bit more context to understand why he is in fact this terrible. And once I started kind of conjuring up his story, it really helped me to affirm why he is this way. And then I started empathizing with him a lot more as a character. And it also was an opportunity to really talk about Tallulah and the relationship between them. And that gave a greater sense as to why, why this dynamic exists to begin with, that she wanted to fix him. They wanted to have a kid to fix them both. And aside from the fact that that was just heartbreaking emotionally, I think it just took some time for me to really, I mean, there's so much in this book I really had to sit with emotionally, just to process how there are probably people in this world. I mean, not probably. I know there are people in this world who would read that and probably feel some kind of way about it. And I thought there probably might be a lot of women who read that and feel upset because maybe it would remind them of somebody or something. And I also thought there might be a lot of men who read that and men aren't reading this, but if they are reading it, they might feel upset that maybe they feel like it's a negative representation of themselves. And it sat heavy with me when I was writing him, because I knew I needed a villain and I knew I needed it to be him. But I think when I gave him a little bit of a backstory, it helped me to hate him less. And I think maybe it helped readers to hate him a little bit less, because people just don't become that way. And it adds to his character a dimension of humanity that you can see in Gabrielle as well, in terms of her own self-loathing and her own insecurity. And without that context, I feel like she herself would not have become so fully realized later on. I hated writing him, basically.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, like, it takes him from being one-dimensional and just a caricature to what could have been a caricature. Because if you know what makes someone see the world the way they do and act the way they do, then they just essentially become a blank screen for us to sort of or as he did, to project our stuff to. And in this way, and that's one of the aspects I love about the book, this idea of how intergenerational trauma, so the way in which racism is internalized and then passed down, interacts with the external racism that is also coming in, which, without giving these things away, which Gabrielle experiences firsthand as well, and her circle of, friends, and her experience with, thinking she was falling in love with a white boy, and that, and then it's not just one of these, it's both the trauma and the sort of internalized trauma and the external racism that is constantly compounding and making new traumas. And that sort of, and that, well, not Yeah.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add to that brilliant point that you just made. Um, how I think that he, in and of himself, is actually one of the greatest representations of intergenerational trauma in the entire book. So Gabrielle's experience is a bit more subtle compared to him, but I think I wanted to create a character where it just you can conjure up a lot of the ghosts I think that have been haunting a lot of people from the South. And you can really understand certain survival mechanisms that came into play in terms of how like respectability politics and how that is a survival mechanism to like convince yourself that if I behave a certain way, then they won't want to kill me. And if I work harder than everybody else, then I can have just as much as they have rather than having more, which would make a lot of sense. And these are all things that I kind of plucked from headlines and plucked from really famous Black men, like Bill Cosby being one of the greatest examples of people who I think have done horrific things. But I guess I just kind of wonder at the end of the day, like they weren't always like that. Where did their humanity die? And I think I wanted to examine that very specific point with Robert, where we kind of skip that place of healing and go straight to projecting and carrying that on to somebody else. And I, rather than explain the whole backstory, I wanted that specific point to be the needle that kind of stuck in everybody's side. Sorry, everybody.
um, and we are getting get to your questions. I can see some questions starting to come up. Her as in Gabrielle's relationship with Tallulah, that was a hard one to read as well, because Tallulah's experiences and the decades now of abuse that she's been subjected to is shaping her relationship with her daughter. So they're unable to have the relationship that they could and should have had. And that's really showcased so like brilliantly and really sadly with the very different relationship that Dominique has with her mother. And so Dominique being the music piano teacher, who I don't know how much more I want to say. I don't want to, again, trying to minimize the spoilers, but who becomes a very important figure in many ways in Gabrielle's life. And so the kind of the sparseness and of the relationships that Gabrielle now has with her mother and her father is really contrasted with the color in Dominique's family's home, the smells, the spices, the cooking, and the colorful relationship that they have. I don't know where I'm going with this in terms of a question. How did that sort of like that element of like, how is it that, okay, let's put this another way. How is it that we can have a relationship like Dominique's with that of her mother, and then at the same time there's people living relationships like Tallulah's with Gabrielle's, like how this very dispersed, very different way of experiencing race from people of the same race. Like, it's just kind of there by the grace of God to go, I could, what is it that happened that they went this way and Gabrielle's family went the other way? Is that making sense?
Do you mean how is the relationship between Gabrielle and Tallulah so like this complicated thing, and then her relationship with Dominique kind of ends up being something completely different, and how she ends up being open to that? Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's a great question actually. So the story opens the story starts off with her talking about the closeness between herself and her mother. It's almost kind of an in utero kind of experience where she's like curled up with her mother. They're really tightly bound with one another. They can feel each other's emotions from across the room. They can feel each other's connection from across the house. They have this bond through the changing of their skin where they, once they're in each other's proximity, like what Gabrielle's mother's skin does, Gabrielle's skin does. And it sounds beautiful, right? It sounds really intimate and connected, which any relationship between a mother and daughter would hopefully be. But there's this kind of element of incestuousness to it as well, where they're also incredibly dependent on each other. And Gabrielle's world is entirely shaped by her mother's emotions and moods and this sort of violent dynamic Tallulah has with her husband, Robert. And it even stunts Gabrielle's like physiological development. You know, we see that she doesn't hit puberty until she's about to leave high school and go on to college, which I think is also representative of just how much she doesn't know about herself at this point because she hasn't really been allowed to be a whole person growing up in this household where she's expected to be white all the time to please her father. And what I love about Dominique, I mean, I love her so much, this character, is how she's everything that's opposite. She's colorful, she's loud, she wants the spices out in the world. She's not hiding them in the bottom of her purse the way Tallulah does. And I think it's just by virtue of simply existing that that Gabrielle begins to question everything about who she is because she sees this other person who represents everything her father hated, but she seems happy and she seems whole and she has this incredibly healthy relationship with her mother where they fight but they make up and they eat together. And I think it's just kind of a testament to how thirsty Gabrielle is, but maybe she's not entirely realizing it until that's just introduced, which I think is life, right? Maybe you want a Big Mac every day. I mean, I don't eat Big Macs, but I don't know. I know you don't either. But maybe you want a sandwich every day until you discover pasta, you know, and then you become kind of obsessed with that particular food group. And I think that's something that's really beautiful about youth and growing up is that you don't know what you're interested in until it's introduced to you. And that's what I really wanted to tap into with the kind of coming of age canon. That was something I wanted to take from that traditional repertoire and apply in the story. You think this is who you are until somebody shows you that maybe it's not. And I really love the tension between the two of them as the story progresses between Dominique and Tallulah, because Tallulah feels like she has to kind of compete for her daughter's attention because her daughter is all she has. And I think that's when it becomes more apparent how problematic the relationship Tallulah has with her daughter actually is. Because it's only natural that you would want to explore and spend time with new and interesting and exciting people because it gives you this insight into who you are. And Tallulah wants to keep her bound up in this kind of womb-like state where the only way she knows who she is by proximity to how her mother is. But that becomes so much more problematic when Tallulah starts experiencing these kinds of mental health crises, because then she doesn't even really know who she is. And she's kind of reckoning with the choices that she's made with this husband while her daughter is kind of seeking a way out. And I feel like that kind of violent break in the story is really symbolic of the music that is structured around and the hurricanes that kind of buffer the beginning and the end without giving too much away.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I wasn't sure whether to ask this or not, but in like, would it be fair? And mainly because, again, I don't want to give like too much of a spoiler, but I think it's not. It ties into what you were saying about how meeting Dominique sort of reveals the sort of the nature, the true nature of Gabrielle's relationship with her mother. So would it be fair to say that ultimately Tallulah fails Gabrielle, given the decades of abuse and then the mental health crisis? Like, is it even fair to say that of someone who has been so deeply traumatized?
You know, I think it is fair. I think it's also fair to say that Tallulah failed herself. And part of the thing with the mental health crises when I was writing that is that I felt like their bond was so strong that for it to be disrupted, it would kind of create some kind of crisis within the mother, because it's kind of unnatural, or I don't know what unnatural and unnatural is for a mom, but it feels in the story kind of unnatural for them to begin this intimately and then to have this break, unless it was facilitated by this abusive relationship with the father. Um, and I think I just wanted to show her own agency in this, that while she was a victim of what she's endured from the man that she married, she also stayed with him for all those years. And she also chose him actively over her daughter and her own well being. And I like to think of her as a survivor in the end, like she chose the circumstances that best facilitated her out of wherever she came from. But there was a cost, and it was a very real human cost. And I did not want to make her a saint because I felt like that removed too much of her own agency in the situation. And I didn't want people to look at her purely as a victim because she was a very powerful person in the story as well. And I guess that was partly just to add some complexity to her character, some complexity to her relationship with Gabrielle as well, and to also give a kind of impetus that would further force Gabrielle to look for ways out of that situation. So, yeah.
Wow. I think we can go to a question now. I see a question from Dorit. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Very good question, actually. So when Dominique meets Gabrielle's father, there is a bit of a silent standoff between the two. I really liked that scene's subtleness. Can you talk a little bit about writing that scene?
Sure. So subtlety is something I'm learning more about every day as a writer. I like to be kind of loud and brass, but I really wanted to create a couple of scenes that cater to tension, something that it was difficult to describe the emotional exchange between a couple of characters without being completely overt about it. That was one of the scenes. The other one was when Gabrielle's father was trying to keep her from going out to celebrate the 4th of July. And in those scenes, I felt like I had to use a little bit more orchestration to discuss how they were feeling, the showing rather than explaining feature that they tell you to do in fiction writing. And I felt like the best way to do that was to highlight the ways that Dominique is visually different from everything else in the story. So I talked about her red velvet shoes, I talked about her red lipstick, I talked about her colorful attire, I talked about her car with the spoiler and how it looked so ugly in their driveway and how he was concerned about the neighbors seeing it. Because at that point you have a very strong sense of what Robert is like and what he expects to be in his house. So it wasn't that difficult, actually. It was just highlighting all the things that he already hates. And as I was writing it, I think I felt a lot of emotional relief about creating this incredibly powerful, confident character who just kind of shuts him up by her actions, sitting down at the piano and playing a piece so beautifully that he has no choice but to accept her as her new piano teacher. And I feel that, and hopefully other readers feel too, that marks kind of like a turning point in Gabrielle's life through music. And that scene was motivated by a particular sequence in Mahler's Third Symphony where you have the introduction of this post horn that has its own moment, and it comes out of nowhere. Like, it doesn't even play on the stage. It comes out of like the corner of the audience. It's separate from the orchestra, and it heralds this new movement into the piece. And I felt like her presence was that moment in the symphony where that something new is happening. It's going to change the entire dynamic between these other people. But it gives you a sense of hope. And so I hope that is insightful.
I think that's answered the question. Let's see if she follows up. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to see if there's Other questions? No, on there. I'll go back to the chat. So talk to me about like you're playing so much with this book, right? So you're playing like the way you tell the story, like the technique, the style, the magical realism, the music, the structure, and it is your first novel. So I'd like to know about the road to writing this. Like, how did you harness sort of these skills so that you were able to juggle it all? Because there is like a lot of boldness in there. What else have you written, basically? How did you point, like, you know?
Well, I've written a lot of stuff. Well, let's say that this is my first major body of work since I started doing stand-up. So when I realized I wanted to be a writer full-time, that's what I wanted to do, I know that I have a tendency to be kind of verbose in my writing. I just really like to spend a lot of time writing descriptions and characters and emotions and colors, obviously. And I felt like I would get a little bit too much into my creative brain while doing that. When it's really important to know how to say something effectively, turn it around quickly, and especially if it's something devastating. Um, the best part about doing stand up comedy is that you have to tell a punchline very quickly without losing the audience and be devastating at the exact same time, hopefully by harnessing an element of truth that people find relatable. So when I started doing stand up comedy in 2015, I want to say, I would write out whole paragraphs of jokes, like storytelling, and then I would cut out every third word and try to figure out a way to say it much more effectively. And that was the way to get people to laugh without losing them. And I thought, well, my first book is going to be probably dark, and my second and third too, probably. And I wanted to incorporate elements of humor in that, elements of performance, um, elements of desire. And that is a skill I really honed doing stand up comedy. Um, it's something I started applying in my essays, it's something I started applying in my short stories, and not so much in journalism, right? You don't really have that creative output. But as I started doing a lot more of that, I moved away from journalism, well, like straight journalism, and moving more into ways to tell effective stories that would devastate people and also entertain them at the same time, because I do feel like books are also a form of entertainment that are basically essential. And for this book, I started off way too complicated, as I tend to do. But once I wrote the first line and then the first 20 pages, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. It just took me 2 years to get to that first line and first 20 pages that I wanted to actually stick with. As for the style of writing itself, I was influenced by ways a lot of writers described Mahler's work. So when I read critical essays about how he wrote his Third Symphony, I feel like writing about music is one of those incredibly talented things. Like writing about visual art is one of those incredibly talented things when you can take a medium that conjures a sense and then properly express it in another sense that that medium was not designed for. So if I wanted to accurately convey music, I figured I needed to read a lot of what music critics were writing about Mahler, and also visual art critics were writing about people like Carrie Mae Weems. And the way that they were able to kind of create this synesthetic response where you're reading something, but you're hearing something, you're seeing something, you're feeling something, you're tasting something, really added an element of poetry to what I wanted to say. And I felt like the story could have only been described in a kind of poetic sense. I couldn't write it like a straight orchestrative, like commercial fiction. I really needed to dig deep and to conjure all elements of creativity to tell it effectively. So that was quite an evolution from the way I started out writing strict journalism. And it took a lot of exposure to different elements, like you said, music, art, and critical race theory, in order to get that creative and literary toolkit to tell this story well, or hopefully well. I guess that's for other people to judge.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. We have another question from Claire. One way that Gabrielle and her mother connect is through storytelling, inventing so much of their own maternal ancestry. Could you discuss how curiosity about one's own family history might create the need for imagination and give birth to storytellers? Ooh, wonderful question.
Wonderful question. Thank you so much, Claire. Yeah, so this is something that I think is really common in people of African descent, particularly African Americans in the southern part of the United States. I was just talking about this with my cousins earlier today when we gathered at one of my distant relatives' houses and going through old pictures to try to figure out, a little bit more of the storyline of my own grandfather, who was very quiet and very reserved about his own life. Um, and I think this, when you try to go back and trace your family history as an African American person, you hit so many walls. So us, for example, we were able to trace back to the lineage of some of the Irish and Scottish slave owners who owned part of our family. But as for the people who they owned, their trails stopped cold. And a lot of them didn't have names. Even some of our grandparents didn't even have birth certificates. And some of them, their death certificates did not have the names of their parents because just nobody knew. And so I think this degree of invention is really core to African American storytelling. I think oral narratives are very common to Indigenous storytelling. When a certain person is assigned a role of cataloging and recording that history so that other people can have a sense of their background and that belonging. And I think the reason why people from marginalized communities tend to attach themselves so powerfully to civil rights leaders, social justice advocates, is because they feel like our own when we kind of have a disconnect from the people who came before us. And that's why you walk into people's homes all over the South, you see pictures of I'm looking at a wall of Audre Lorde, Malcolm X, Ida B. Wells, Nina Simone on my cousin's wall right now because they feel like part of us and their stories become our stories. And I think that's a survival tool and a survival mechanism that allows us to feel more complete in who we are because we're all fighting for the same things. We all want the same things. It's just that some people have become leaders and helped us move in that direction a lot more. So the other thing with the maternal ancestry that I love examining is that there's this history in this tradition in literature where if you're going to inherit magic, it's through the maternal bloodline. And I was making a joke with somebody the other day. It's like, wow, you don't get anything from your dad. They never pass on the magic in these stories. It always comes to the mother. And I think that's just something that we tend to do because obviously the power of giving birth, but also that is the best way that we are able to like connect to each other. Like who carried you, who nursed you, who brought you into this world. And giving birth is actually a very violent act. It's like blood and pain. And I think that the person that brings you into this world is the person that kind of has the most right to tell you your place in it. And at least that's the starting off point for this book anyway, before she learns that for herself. So I do think that people who have felt that kind of absence in the completeness of their family tree would probably resonate with this. Because I know that it's something that's a really common story for a lot of people that, were bought and sold in the transatlantic slave trade, not just us, but a lot of people from indigenous ancestry, a lot of people all over the Caribbean and mixed ancestry. The records just aren't there. And I think that reinvention is powerful. I think it's meaningful. And I think it's one way to reclaim our identities. And I don't think anybody has the right to take that away. So that's why I wanted to start with that.
Well, thank you so much for that answer and that question.
Wonderful question. Thank you, Claire.
It has another comment. I have question and Vinal, awesome question. They were both very good questions. Thank you. Now, if there are no more, we might have time for another quick one. Otherwise, I'll invite ER back in to, give you a link, tell you how you can grab this book from Charis bookstores, and please do so if you can.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This is a beautiful conversation, and thanks to everybody engaging in the chat and asking such good questions. Folks can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy notes on her color from Charis. You can also buy Ruby's book from Charis. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. So thank you. And I know some of you said you've already bought and read the book. I know we sold a lot in the week leading up to the event. So thank you for that. We love that. And just love that y'all have spent your evening with us. So thank you. This event will be put up on our YouTube channel in the coming days. So if there's anybody who you are like, oh, my friend, I wish they could have been here to watch this, let them know. It'll be up on the Charis YouTube channel. Send it to them and spread the love about Jennifer's book, because we want her to get all of the praise and accolades. So please share, and also request from your local library. That's another great way to get the word out. So again, thank you both so much for this rich conversation and the rich questions. We really love having conversations like this.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this wonderful event, and thank you, Charis, for hosting. It's been an absolute pleasure. Ruby, you're such a star. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. You're such a deep thinker. It's incredible. So thanks for letting me be a tiny part of it.
Thank you.
Take care, y'all.